relatively short period of time, from the mid-50s through to the early 70s, James H Schmitz wrote 29 stories ranging from shorts to novellas, and 2 novels that shared a common setting occurring roughly 1,500 years in our future. The Federation of the Hub, a widespread area near the center of the Milky Way galaxy comprising 1,300 member worlds and many others loosely associated or connected to the Federation. Schmitz created a future history here, but with the exception of 2 or so stories, we only glimpse a moment in time of this far future society. The majority of these stories, especially those centering around Telsey Amberden and Trigger Argy, his best-known characters, all occur in a roughly 3-year period. Nearly all other stories could occur years apart from one another, but not drastically, as many hints suggest that this is a time of recent stability for the Federation. World building is sparse at first, as Schmitz created this future over a couple of decades across his many stories. We know very little of the early days of humanity's spread across the stars. With FTL technology, solar systems were settled by a plethora of nations and organizations during a handful of centuries. But this loosely organized exodus would be widely disrupted by humanity's burgeoning psi abilities. Whether this was the blooming of a latent human talent, as suspected, or purposely bred, as it was on at least one planet, or a combination of the two, many details of this period, dubbed the War Centuries, are lost to the historians of the Federation. Though maybe not entirely to the Federation's overgovernment itself, that shadowy organization that, along with its various departments and services, oversees and enforces, albeit lightly, the rules and regulations that for the past 500 or so years have seen humanity regroup and once more prosper. The War Centuries were the result of issues both political and economic, but more unbalancing than either was the appearance of rogue psi talents, rare human telepaths who'd begun to use their abilities for their own gains. If a sufficiently skilled telepath with questionable morals felt so inclined, they could completely control another individual. In fact, they could control many with proper honing of their psi talents, and sometimes with the help of psi-based technology, one such individual could come to rule a planet of virtual slaves. And many did. Worlds, once Earth colonies, now flourishing nations, fell to individuals and groups alike who used their talents for greed and corruption. The solution to this problem? An organized group of both psis and non-psis with mind shields and proper training, working together to thwart and disable rogue telepaths. Many worlds were reclaimed by them. This group, once the Federation took form at the end of the War Centuries, would come to be known as the Psychology Service. And over the coming decades and centuries, their power of influence over an unknowing collection of 1,300 worlds would come to shape the hub into what we know it as at the time the stories take place. The overgovernment was an essentially benevolent institution, if you could overlook their policy of non-intervention in any given planet's affairs except in the most serious of requirements. This philosophy is further hinted at in the novel The Demon Breed. But it knew the greatest potential danger to the hub from within its own borders was rogue use of telepathy. The service spent considerable energy putting out false information to inhibit the belief and knowledge of psi where possible, and installing secretive equipment in spaceports and other heavily traveled facilities to detect those psi abilities, and then keep an eye on them, or even recruit them to the service. As a result, most psychology service operations are covert. They feel very special circumstances from E&M Bank's culture books. A psychology service agent is often on a foreign planet, blending among the native population, armed with secret service-type tools and gadgetry, and seeking out and putting an end to a threat that the population may not even be aware of. Sometimes it's the subtle mental manipulations of someone's memories, motives, or personality. Other times it's the apprehension of a rogue psi, human or otherwise, or prevention of their machinations. There are many other intelligent alien species in this universe, some of which have psi abilities. And just like humanity, some use them for good, others for evil. Some even masquerade as human, and if they cause the Federation no real problems, the service and overgovernment will simply keep tabs on them through a subdivision of the psychology service called symbiote control, further enforcing the overgovernment's philosophy of non-intervention. One such psychology service agent who appears across 3 stories and who interacts with both Trigger and Telsey is Pilch. We first meet Pilch in Sour Note on Paliada, published in Astounding November 1956. Even in such an early story, the service and their abilities are very well fleshed out. Arriving in a distant solar system at the behest of the local human government, Pilch and her team need to unravel the mystery of the planet's native humanoids and their strange behavior. For they might actually be a distributed consciousness with psi abilities, acting like a race of individuals. Such an entity, were it to travel beyond its own solar system, could spell widespread mayhem for the hub. This is an ambitious tale in its depiction of deep mind probing and alien first contact that feels like it could have been written decades later. In fact, a lot of the tools and technology characters use in this universe reads like modern-day science fiction. People keep in touch by using the ComWeb, which is basically the internet interfaced with via handheld devices and computer terminals. When we next come across Pilch, she's been called in to look into Trigger Argy's mind in the novel Legacy, originally titled A Tale of Two Clocks, published in 1962. After several other Psychology Service agents of lesser ability have failed to unravel a mystery she carries inside her. Pilch appears once more in the short story Compulsion, published in the June 1970 edition of Analog, the story where Trigger and Telsey first meet. And it's here that Telsey steals a look into Pilch's mind and prompts her to reveal something of herself and the service. "There's one question," Telsey said. "How old are you, Pilch?" Pilch smiled. "Never you mind how old I am." "You were there before they founded the Federation," Telsey said reflectively. "If you saw that," said Pilch, "you've also seen that I helped found the Federation, and that I helped maintain it. You might keep it in mind. Anytime a snip of a psi genius can be useful in one of my projects, I'll use her." Telsey shook her head slightly. "I don't think you'll use me again." Pilch's knowing gray eyes regarded her a moment. Then her hand reached down and touched Telsey's cheek. Something like a surge of power flowed through Telsey and was absorbed. She blinked, startled. Pilch smiled. "We'll see, little sister. We'll see," she said. Then she was gone. The Psychology Service itself feels somewhat like Neil Asher's polity AIs. In that universe, the AIs are practically all-knowing. A lot of Asher's plots have characters unraveling a mystery, only to learn in the end that the AIs already knew the details and the outcome, and had put our main characters in these positions to solve these things for themselves. The Service and the Overgovernment are kind of like that, using other people and their talents to meet their own ends. A large number of these stories, and the best known, are those that involve Telsey Amberden, teenage daughter of a high-ranking overgovernment official. She's a law student with a high IQ attending college on her homeworld of Arado, the planetary seat of the Federation's overgovernment. It's through her stories of self-discovery and the refining of her psi abilities that much of the hub's world-building is exposed to us. At a glance, her stories may seem like young adult, and perhaps early on they do have a touch of that aesthetic, but she quickly becomes much more than a child, as she relates to a detective early on in the story Resident Witch, when he questions having a child involved in the recapturing of a hostage. "Corvin Vergard," Telsey said. He looked back at her. "Yeah?" "I'm not reading your thoughts," she said. "I don't have to. You've been told who I am, and that I'm 16 years old. So I'm a child who comes of a very good family and has been very carefully raised. Somebody really too nice to get shot tonight if things go wrong, right?" Vergard studied her a long moment. "I may have had such notions," he said. "Perhaps I've been wrong about you." "You've definitely been wrong about me. You didn't know enough. I've been a practicing psi, for almost a year. I can go through a human life in an hour and know more about it than the man or woman who's living it. I've gone through quite a few lives, not only human lives. I do other things that I don't talk about. I don't know what it all exactly makes me now, but I'm not a child. It might even be that sometimes people like you and Welling Dassinger look a little like children to me. Do you understand?" "I'm not sure," Vergard said. He shook his head. "I believe I'm beginning to." We learn of psi and telepathy through her, and of the Psychology Service, who she deduces must exist before they even make themselves known to her with repeated attempts of recruiting her to the service. She never does join them, although the end of T's Toys, her penultimate story, does see a clone of her joining the service. But through contacts like Pilch, she does occasionally work for them when not unraveling mysteries she's stumbled upon herself. She becomes a kind of free agent, though it's heavily implied the service will always be keeping tabs on her with her unusually strong talents. Through prior adventures, these talents also become known to another agency in the hub that appears in several stories. The Kith Interstellar Detective Agency. With offices on a dozen planets, multiple agents appear in several stories, either as secondary characters to someone like Telsey, as she lends her skills to them on an operation, or stars the main character themselves. The one-off appearance of Danistar Gems, communications expert for the agency in the story The Searcher from Analog, February 1966, is one of Schmitz's finest stories. In it, Danistar and her colleague Corwin Bergard inadvertently get between a criminal organization dealing with corrupt officials selling an alien artifact and an artificial nanorobotic cloud of light created by an extinct race who very much wants this artifact back. Again, Schmitz has a strong female character who manages to outwit others when the odds are against her, and not with psi abilities, but with cunning and technical prowess. Multiple services and government departments are mentioned throughout the stories that keep the hub running and, as a result, wield certain knowledge and privileges. The University League has establishments on multiple worlds and houses samples and artifacts from worlds all over the galaxy for safekeeping and study. There's the Space Scout Intelligence Agency, which serves as the Federation's interstellar secret service. We learn about them through Heslet Quillen, an agent often posing as a member of the Space Engineers Guild but actually on assignment undercover. Agents of Space Scout Intelligence, as well as the Psychology Service, are often equipped with various tools, such as sneak suits, anti-interrogation drugs, life masks that change one's appearance, restructure equipment which can show previous events or conversations, alternatively, scramblers and distorters which render the recording of events and conversation impossible, gravity mines, dead brain equipment used to interrogate the recently deceased, moment of truth and hypnosprays used for interrogation or coercion. Pre-colonization, or simply pre-call, is a service that determines whether or not a planet is fit for human occupation, and if so, lays the groundwork for future colonists. It's through this group that we first meet Trigger Argy in Harvest Time, first published in the 1958 September edition of Astounding. Trigger is Schmidt's second best-known character. She starts out as a communications chief for the current operation on the planet of Manon. Her boss, Halati Tate, also appears in several stories. In this story, she's somewhat a peripheral character to Halati, but through him ends up being present during a major discovery that's explored further in the novel Legacy. Her actions in this novel lead to further revelations of the galaxy's earlier history, and she subsequently becomes intertwined with the last remaining members of a former great race, a detail only her and the Psychology Service are privy to. As she gains knowledge and skills throughout her adventures, she too becomes a sort of free agent of the Federation's overgovernment, and ultimately might just become a Psychology Service agent herself. The entirety of the Federation of the Hub can be read in the 4 collections edited by Eric Flint in the early 2000s and published by Baen, though I strongly recommend reading Volume 3 second and Volume 2 third, so as to read both Telsey and Trigger's early stories first before encountering their later shared adventures in Volume 2. Schmitz was a pioneer of strong female leads and excellent at the show-don't-tell method. His world-building occurs seemingly effortlessly around the plot, and he was great at creating unique creatures and ecologies. Among these stories, we see or at least hear mention of over 30 named planets or solar systems, each with its own unique environments and cultures. Also worth mentioning is the independent fleets, groupings of traveling spacecraft that have their own societies and only deal with the hub peripherally. His stories often center on themes of ecology and corruption or abuse of power. They also have a touch of humor to them and usually involve a mystery that requires inventive problem-solving from the protagonists. A few of the stories I found particularly enjoyable: Child of God, wherein another telepath manages to take control of Telsey and forces her to do his dirty work for him, which largely involves determining what has taken over the employees of his illegal mining operation and quickly turns into simply trying to survive an encounter with something stranded from another galaxy on this desert planet. Compulsion, where Trigger and Telsey attempt to prove a species of tree with psi abilities not only has intelligence, but isn't as malevolent as it seems. This one's enjoyable as some plot threads and themes from the novel Legacy carry over. In Balanced Ecology, we see an ecosystem that has adapted to a human presence on its world, rather than the other way around. In Grandpa, we follow a 15-year-old boy who works for Precall, settling a new world for future colonists. When his seniors disregard his misgivings about a change in the wildlife's behavior, it's his keen observations and intuition that save the day. And The Searcher, where 2 Kith detective agents desperately try to remain alive long enough to get a signal outside of the force field-blocked compound they're trapped in, while an alien entity wreaks havoc searching for stolen property. The world of the Hub is immense, and at times seemingly just barely holding together thanks to the work of covert agencies and individuals. It's a setting of endless possibilities within its logical construction, and having read through its entirety, one can't help but imagine the continued threats to the Federation of the Hub, and how they're met by characters like Pilch, Telsey and Trigger Argy.